It's an existential crisis on Segaiden episode 50. When is a light gun game not a light gun game? When it's Zillion, the game about the Sega light phaser that does not use the Sega light phaser. Zillion for Master System takes us back to a persistent bee in Sega's 8-bit bonnet, anime. Once SG-1000 broke the seal with Golgo 13 and Orgus in April 1984, no one living in Japan would be safe from home console games based on anime properties. Bandai entered the fray in late 1985 with Macross, Kinnikuman, and Obake no Kyutaro for Famicom. And suddenly publishers across the country realized that quality was no issue. Kids would buy any old crap as long as it featured their favorite cartoon characters on the box. Sega, of course, took the high road, bestowing licensed properties with far better games than they properly deserved. I mean, compare their take on Fist of the North Star with the series' interpretations on Famicom. Even the mess that was high school Kimengumi deserves props for being an ambitious mess. And of course, if Alex Kidd in Miracle World had followed its original trajectory, it would have been the best 8-bit rendition of Dragon Ball ever made. That didn't happen though, and that perhaps explains the more comprehensive approach Sega took with Zillion. Rather than simply adapting an existing property into a game, Sega took an active hand in the creation of Zillion, working with Tatsunoko Productions to create a true cross-media effort. This yielded mixed results, but that seems to have been the case for such endeavors more often than not. At the very least, Zillion worked out better than Capcom's attempt a couple of years later to create a multimedia sensation with Strider, which tied a console game to a manga. The game never shipped in Japan, and the manga never saw release in the US. Zillion, on the other hand, resulted in a game that enjoyed international release, an anime that ran to completion and saw limited worldwide distribution, and a highly successful standalone toy. Oh, and it may have factored into the Master System hardware too. Zillion, whose full Japanese title translates into Red Photon Zillion, followed on the heels of the early 80s sci-fi fad and anime that exploded after Gundam caught on with the budding otaku scene, who transformed a failed television series into a movement. Kind of like what Star Trek had done in the US 10 years earlier. Tatsunoko had co-produced the first post-Gundam mecha hit, Super Dimension Fortress Macross. That show became so popular that where the original Mobile Suit Gundam cartoon had been cancelled before its complete run of episodes aired, the network actually ordered additional episodes of Macross to expand the story beyond its cataclysmic finale. Tatsunoko chased that high for years, producing the remainder of the shows that Harmony Gold would smoosh together into Robotech for the US, but never quite hitting the same high note. Zillion followed a few years after the final episodes of Genesis Climber Mospeada and Super Dimension Cavalry Southern Cross, and saw the studio regrouping for another try. So, two companies chasing after what might have beens got together and combined their competencies, and thus was Zillion born. Zillion the anime and Zillion the game debuted a month apart in Japan. April 87 for the show, May 87 for the Mark III cartridge. But of course, both were conceived long before that. Given Sega's rapid turnaround time for console game production in the 8-bit era, we can pretty easily assume the game's conception happened well into the cartoon's production, which means the game gives players a fairly authentic take on the cartoon, albeit not one based directly on any single anime storyline. The television series most likely began production in mid-1986, which would put its initial design processes right around the time that Sega began ramping up manufacturing and distribution for the American Master System launch. Make a note that that's also around the time that Fantasy Zone made its arcade debut. And so, Red Photon Zillion, a show that revolved around a highly advanced laser pistol that represents humanity's only defense against conquest by the vile Gnosis Empire. A laser pistol that looks exactly like Sega's light phaser light gun, which made its debut in the US about half a year before Zillion first aired. Also on hand, Opa Opa, the protagonist of Fantasy Zone, who appears here as the plucky robotic mascot of the heroic White Knights. Opa Opa speaks in simplistic language and tries hard, despite his penchant for screwing up, fulfilling the era's R2-D2 wannabe quotient of characters like Haro from Gundam, Twiki from Buck Rogers, and so on. So, a clever tie-in. The Zillion series absolutely burst at the seams with Sega energy for cross-marketing synergy. Kids would see Opa Opa and the light phaser and rush to stores to buy a Mark III, right? Well, except that the Mark III didn't support the light phaser, and the Mark III didn't have any light gun games. This turned out not to matter particularly much in the long run for Sega, as the company repurposed the light phaser's molds to create a laser tag style game called, yes, Zillion. Available in Japan, Brazil, and Europe, the standalone Zillion set sold remarkably well and remained on the market into the 1990s. And the Zillion show managed to complete its 31-episode run, making it a moderate success in its original market. Zillion the show didn't fare quite so well overseas. A failed localization shipped in the US from Streamline Pictures in 1991 before fizzling after 5 episodes. Eclipse Comics weirdly adapted Zillion into a 4-issue comic series in 1993, long after the game had any hope of relevance. But hey, Americans at least got the video game interpretation of Zillion. And it was pretty good, offering Master System fans a touch of counter-programming to the non-linear action games that had begun to emerge on NES with the likes of Rygar, The Goonies 2, and of course Metroid. Yes, the game based around the show that featured Master System's light gun does not in fact use the light gun. This would seem absolutely bizarre but for the fact that, once again, the Japanese Mark III couldn't use the light gun and therefore it wouldn't have made any sense for a game designed as a tie-in for a Japanese television program to require a dependency on an inaccessible peripheral. So, instead of presenting Zillion fans with a light gun game, Sega instead gave them Master System's answer to Metroid. No, just kidding. Zillion wholly takes its design cues from an entirely different source, Epyx's Impossible Mission. In fact, it's honestly impossible to overstate just how much Zillion owes to Impossible Mission. It's a brazen knockoff that takes its moment-to-moment action almost directly from the computer classic. If you're familiar with Sega's pre-Master System console history, which of course you are after marathoning my SG-1000 retrospective series, the concept of a Sega-made Impossible Mission knockoff actually makes a lot of sense. Sega licensed a healthy number of Bruderbund and Activision titles for SG-1000, and it carried that Activision torch forward with its brilliant adaptation of Ghostbusters for Master System. Clearly, the company's designers drew inspiration from that same well when producing Zillion. Here, you descend into an elevator base which consists of rooms connected by corridors and elevators, just like those in Impossible Mission. Each room contains a computer that you need to activate in order to advance, just like in Impossible Mission. Each room also contains small vaults that you need to unlock, in this case by blasting them with the Zillion weapon, in order to obtain codes, just like in Impossible Mission. And you need to gun down Norza's troops and evade traps, which actually does differ from Impossible Mission, in which you could only evade rather than shoot. And you don't have to fret about Impossible Mission's single-hit kills, since protagonist JJ has a health meter that allows him to soak up quite a few hits before he dies. You can even collect power-ups to replenish his health, or return to the White Knight's ship at the perimeter of the enemy base to recharge. Doing that also allows you to grab a new ID card, which you'll need in order to interact with the base's computers. Actually, while Impossible Mission provided the core inspiration here, Zillion does take many cues from non-linear action games of the era. It's less a comprehensive clone of Epyx's game than it is a spiritual sequel, adding far greater sense of character and map progression while integrating more elements into the adventure. So yes, you probably do see some Metroid influence here, even though this does not in any way constitute a direct analog for that game. Master System fans would have to wait until 1989 for their Metroid killer. But you'll recognize how some of the gating works. JJ can power up his gun through 3 levels of effectiveness. The Zillion's max power level doesn't just sizzle through Norsa goons with ease, it can also open more secure vaults. The vaults in each room of the Norsa base come in multiple flavors of durability, and at the game's outset you can't blast open level 2 or level 3 vaults. This means that certain rooms hold power-ups or, more importantly, computer codes that you can't access until you've upgraded your firepower. So, just as in Metroid, you need to explore the base and seek out those weapon upgrades. And you need to collect key items, like the infrared goggles that will prevent you from tripping invisible sensor beams that'll summon a squad of enemy soldiers to your current location. You also need to acquire the ability to jump higher than JJ's default in order to clear certain obstacles and reach new areas. In this case though, you can't simply grab a pair of high jump boots. Instead, Zillion leans into its media property connections and grants this ability to a different member of the White Knights, Apple. While White Knight mascot Opa Opa pops up throughout the maze as a collectible to grant you a negligible max health boost and, more importantly, a full health refill, JJ's comrades Apple and Champ become playable characters once you find them. Apple can jump higher than her comrades, but starts with basic attack strength, and needs to collect Zillion upgrades in order to fight. While Champ is too beefy to be an effective jumper, but enters the fray late in the game already enhanced with max weapon power. Each of the characters has their own life meter. Champ's is the biggest, and Apple's is the frailest naturally. And each one suffers differing degrees of damage from enemy attacks and hazards. Would you believe that Apple gets hit hardest by bad guys, while Champ only suffers half as much health loss per attack? Okay, so maybe Zillion doesn't exactly shatter game design cliches here. Then again, in 1987, you could hardly consider any sort of multi-character system to be a cliche. Heck, Sega managed to beat the release of Nintendo's own multi-character transmedia property Doki Doki Panic to market by a couple of months, meaning that Zillion helped pioneer all those game design cliches in the first place. And each character gains durability as they collect Opa Opas. By the time they all max out at level 8, with a fully boosted Zillion, they all take the same amount of damage from enemy attacks. At that point, their only real differences amount to their max HP and the fact that Champ is kinda slow and useless while Apple can still jump crazy high. If Zillion has a shortcoming, and ambitious Master System games always come with caveats, probably as a result of Sega's unbelievably compressed development timelines, it's that it offers way too much and too complex a game to be easily manageable in a single sitting until you've really memorized the entire base layout. This puts it on the same footing as Rygar or Section Z for NES, I suppose, both of which drop players into a nonlinear adventure without passwords or save batteries and said, good luck. Except that Section Z was originally designed around saving on disk system, and Rygar at least had infinite continues. Zillion offers a single life, with one single continue, at least until you liberate Apple or Champ, who become reserve lives. I think this is a first for a Sega-developed console game. Off the top of my head, the only game I can think of with a continue feature that we've seen so far on Master System or SG-1000 was Westone Escape's Wonder Boy, and that was an undocumented inclusion. This is a pretty brutal game in the Sega tradition in a way that doesn't really complement its scale. The difficulty level is super high, compounded by slightly sticky controls and a hint of input lag. Once you reach the second zone of the game and have to deal with Norsa troops who can fire while standing or crawling, you need to perform quick evasions that the control scheme doesn't really support. Worse, some essential rooms are designed in a way that requires you to shut off barriers, duck into another room, and then backtrack. This leaves you no choice but to take a hit from that barrier on your return, since the code to shut off the energy beam only lasts a few seconds, and the computer that you use to input the code is on the opposite side of the energy beam. Or else, you have to use a different room's computer to warp back to the ship at the start of the game to avoid taking the hit. I know it's possible to complete the game with the tools Sega provided, because people have done it, but I doubt I'll ever manage it. Reaching Apple's prison cell in this episode's recording session before dying pitifully is the furthest I've ever made it in Zillion, which is a shame because I really do like the game. In just a little more than a year of American Master System releases, we've really seen Sega begin to come to terms with the differences between arcade and home console game design, and Zillion represents a huge step forward in that journey. It's a game that comes within spitting distance of being a true classic. With a few quality of life improvements, heck, even infinite continues that send you back to the White Knight's ship when you die while retaining all your other progress, this would be a big, sprawling, but ultimately reasonable challenge, as opposed to a big, sprawling, unreasonable challenge. I'd say that's just the grumpy old man in me speaking, but no, this game vexed me, even back in the days when I had time and patience to deal with 8-bit BS. But now we must ask, what did Sega Visions say? Yes, that's right, Nintendo wasn't the only company that knew how to do direct marketing to its audience. Just as Nintendo had the Fun Club News, Sega published its own newsletter, which first reached subscribers sometime in either late 1987 or early 1988. Originally called Sega Challenge, the newsletter changed its name to Team Sega a few issues in. And a few issues after that, it ended to be replaced by a paid publication. Yep, just like the Fun Club News being replaced by Nintendo Power, Team Sega ran for 7 issues before evolving into a proper magazine, a term I would not bestow upon the earlier newsletter. Also like Fun Club News, Team Sega lacked much in the way of substance, primarily consisting of brief advertorial blurbs and mini articles extolling the virtues of Master System and its games, intermixed with cheat codes and promotions. The publication even had its own Howard Phillips in the form of Steve Hanawa, a designer and programmer who helped establish Sega of America after bringing hit games like Turbo into the world. Perhaps most interestingly, Team Sega also gave Sega fans entree into a handful of unique, exclusive, subscriber-only options. That includes early access to the rapid-fire unit peripheral and even an entire exclusive game in the form of Power Strike, a mail-order-only localization of Alesta. And while the newsletter didn't have much of substance to say about Zillion, because it didn't really say much of substance about anything, Zillion did receive a one-page promotional article in issue 2 that included a handful of general tips. Super useful things like don't step on mines and learn the maze. More intriguingly, Sega Challenge offered Zillion its very own mail-order exclusive. Readers could send away for a free map of the game. Based on a very old thread on the SMS Power message boards, and a comment by site owner Maxim, this appears to have been a 3-page Xeroxed tip sheet whose map consisted of a simple grid depicting the location of a few key items. So not exactly a cool giveaway on the level of a complete box copy of Power Strike, but still an interesting little facet of Sega history. Next time on Segaiden, we say hello again to Fantasy Zone, while bidding adieu to 1987.